for this continuing education program which they have organized. And I was told this is the 25th lecture. Congratulations to all those lawyers who are involved in this great exercise. Coming to the subject, as a trial lawyer, among all the suits which a trial lawyer comes across, his favorite would be the law of injunctions, a suit for injunction. A criminal lawyer would be extremely happy if he gets a bail to an accused whom he represents. Similarly, a civil lawyer would be the happiest person if he is able to get an injunction, more so an ex parte order of temporary injunction. That's a great victory, especially for those lawyers who, at the commencement of the profession, are able to get this. Their happiness cannot be measured. That's why I will be telling the judges, ನಮ್ಮ ವಕೀಲ ಮಿತ್ರರೆಲ್ಲ ಬಹಳ ಅಲ್ಪ ತೃಪ್ತರು ಅಂತ. ಯಾಕೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಒಂದು ಅಡ್ಜರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಕೊಟ್ಬಿಟ್ರೆ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಇಷ್ಟ ಆಗೋಗ್ಬಿಡುತ್ತೆ ಮಕ. ಇನ್ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ದೊಡ್ಡದಾಗಬೇಕು ಒಂದು ಇಂಜೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಅವರು ಇಷ್ಟು ಕೊಟ್ರೆ ಇನ್ ಮಿಕ್ಕಿದ್ದೇನೂ ಕೇಳಲ್ಲ ಅವರು. ಹಾಗೆ ದಿಸ್ ಇಂಜಂಕ್ಷನ್ is a very, according to me, very efficacious remedy about which not only the lawyers, even the litigant public is very fond of. Because this injunction as a remedy prevents wrongs and preserving the rights of the litigant public. It is flexible, adjustable to all circumstances known to the process of law. All that happens in an order of injunction is, it is a order and a direction or a command from a court framed according to the circumstance of the case, commanding an act which the court regards as essential to justice, or restraining an act which it esteems contrary to equity and good conscience. This is a branch of law which we have inherited from the Britishers. It is the courts of chancery in England which are granting this order of injunctions. It is a long history. But when it comes to India, probably even in those days, the Britishers did not take a chance. Though it was a common law remedy, in India, they codified it. They codified it and made it certain. In India, this branch of law today is contained in the Civil Procedure Code as well as the Specific Relief Act, which supplements the code and occupies a middle ground between the substantive law on the one hand and the procedure on the other. Civil Procedure Code is of 1908. Specific Relief Act is of 1887, not the present one, the predecessor. Therefore, from the inception, more than a century, this branch of law is codified in India. See, if you ask a lawyer, what are you doing in the High Court? He says, I'm practicing the High Court on the constitutional law. What is the constitutional law? A writ petition under Article 226 and 227. Beyond that, it does not know the Constitution. Similarly, in the civil court, when we talk about injunction, Order 39, Rule 1 and 2 of CPC, it ends there. It commences and ends there. But the law of injunction is a wonderful branch of law. If you take keen interest and look into the various facets of this law, probably Not only you will appreciate it, and you could be more helpful to the litigants who need this relief at the hands of the court. Therefore, for a person to have a sound knowledge of injunction, what is that he must look to in law? Is the question. Not mere 39 rule 1 and 2. That is purely a procedural law. In fact, injunctive relief is a specific relief. That is why it finds a place in the Specific Relief Act. Part 3 of the Specific Relief Act deals with preventive reliefs. It's called preventive reliefs. Chapter 7 in Part 3 deals with injunctions generally. Section 36 of the Act deals with how a preventive relief is granted. 37 deals with temporary and perpetual injunctions. Then chapter 8 deals with perpetual injunctions or permanent injunctions, as it is popularly known as. Section 38 sets out how a perpetual injunction is granted in a suit. As opposed to this preventive relief, we have in section 39 what is called as a mandatory injunction, compelling a person to do a positive act, not a preventive relief. And then not only a person is entitled to injunctive relief, in the course of it he sustains damages. Section 40 deals with damages in lieu of or in addition to the injunction. Then we have what is called as section 41. This is more important because this sets out the cases in which an injunctive relief cannot be granted. If the earlier section says in what cases relief injunction could be granted, how it should be granted, 41 specifically says in what cases injunctive relief cannot be granted. And more importantly, when we talk about injunction, most of the time it is a positive act, a positive covenant in a contract, or a statutory right in a law. Section 42 speaks about what is called as injunction to perform a negative agreement. There is a positive agreement and a negative agreement. A person may not be entitled to the positive agreement, but section 42 says, even in such cases, by way of an injunction, a negative agreement could be enforced. This is broadly the substantive law dealing with injunctions, which is prevalent in our country. Now, coming to the procedural law, section 94 clause C of the Civil Procedure Code, read with order 39 rules 1 to 5, deals with what is called as temporary injunctions. So, substantive law is contained in the Specific Relief Act. Procedural law is contained in the Civil Procedure Code. Therefore, knowledge of both these branches of law is a must if a person has to approach a court for the relief of injunction. It will give you confidence because knowledge is power. And knowledge is nobody's monopoly. Sometimes we find younger members of the bar complain. When a senior lawyer appears, court readily grants injunction. When a junior lawyer appears, the same treatment is not given. I don't say it is completely incorrect, but one of the reasons why a junior member finds it difficult to get a relief is want of comprehensive knowledge of this branch of law. An injunction is not given merely by looking at the face. When a lawyer puts a question, the judge puts a question, the confidence with which the lawyer answers certainly counts in the mind of a judge. And he feels secure, and therefore he will grant an injunction. So, my appeal to the younger members of the bar, you are more intelligent than my generation. Mere intelligence is not good. There should be knowledge of law. There should be hard work. With your intelligence, if you combine hard work and a comprehensive knowledge of procedural law and substantive law, I am sure this complaint, which I find will not be there in future to come. But if you think that, I find sometimes it is the might is right, it doesn't work. Judges are not persons who are going to be afraid of you, afraid of your personality. They will judge you by the way you make your submission, the way you have understood the law, and you also should develop what is called as a persuasive capacity. If that is not there, mere intelligence doesn't take you too far. Therefore, a good knowledge of statutory provisions is very much important. In fact, you have more than 100 years of case law dealing with this subject. And if you find time, if not 100 years, there are many leading cases on this point, both by English courts, American courts, Indian courts, our Supreme Court and High Court. If you are able to broadly read these judgments, because for a civil lawyer, this is the first step in his career as a civil lawyer, especially in the track. It will go a long way in getting confidence if you are able to do this homework at the earliest. Here, let me caution those intelligent youngsters who are all product of 5-year law courses. It's my experience, some of our lawyers, especially 5-year students who are coming from 5-star colleges, have no respect for the Indian courts. They always try to look into what Harvard University Journal has said, what American courts have said, what beautiful articles are written by Westerners. Absolutely, there is no prohibition, objection for your reading that and acquiring the knowledge. But what is more important is, when once this law of injunctions is codified in this country and it is interpreted by the apex court and our high court, our courts will only look into this interpretation, not what is written in your Harvard journal or what is the view expressed by a great jurist or even the law laid on by the English courts under common law jurisdiction. So therefore, after all, this injunction, as I said, is today statutorily provided. No Indian court can go beyond the statute. Statute exhaustively covers the subject. Apart from that, the domestic life in our country is totally different from the society in England or America. For that country, that law may be suitable. But in our country, as we have a statute law, all the interpretation should be revolves around the statutes. And therefore, time and again it has been said, though we have inherited the Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence, these principles of injunctions have been inherited by us from English courts. In its application, you have to be guided by the statute and you have to be guided by our society and its requirements. Then only we will be doing justice to the cause. Now, when we talk about this injunction, in English courts or in England, few principles have evolved over the years. And those principles are also followed in this country. Because, as I said, this relief is an equitable relief. Justice should be done to the party. The court should be flexible. It cannot be put on a straitjacket formula. And therefore, what are these principles which are evolved over the years in this country? First, you must bear in mind before you go into the statutory policies. The first and the foremost principle which a lawyer should bear in mind is, when you go to court to prevent a defendant from doing a particular act, first you must establish that you have a legal right. If you don't have a legal right, however wrong the other man may be, you have no right to go to court. Existence of a legal right is a must. It is a condition precedent for any court to exercise its jurisdiction of granting injunction. That right may flow from a statute. It may flow from a contract. It may be in respect of an immovable property, or it may be otherwise cognizable by law. It is only the violation of that right that will be prohibited. Of course, it is not an absolute right. If it is other considerations of policy or expediency forbid a court from resorting to this prohibitive remedy, however good your right may be, the court will decline to extend its hand. Therefore, first you must know what your right is. One of the reasons why I am stressing on this is, today lawyers, youngsters are far ahead of my generation. They're all well educated from the beginning. Their English is good. They are smart. They dress smartly. They think broadly. They are exposed to everything. But a court cannot grant an order of injunction by looking at all these things. Court grants an injunction only when you have set out that right in a proper manner in the pleadings. Therefore, before you think of an injunction, the pleadings which you are going to put it into the court should disclose that right of yours which is infringed or sought to be infringed. So drafting plays a very important role in a suit for injunction. It is not number of pages you have drafted. It is not the quantity, it is the quality of the drafting. So therefore, please bear in mind, when you draft a suit where you are seeking a relief of injunction, unless that pleading discloses a right, a statutory right, a contractual right, a right in immovable property, or any manner of right, custom, usage, trade, whatever it is, existence of a right is a condition precedent for the court considering your request for grant of injunction. Therefore, this is not what is stated in the statute, but if you read the entire statute as a whole, after all, what for the courts are meant? Courts are meant to protect your rights. Courts are meant to enforce your rights. And if there is no right, court has no business to hear you, or the role of a court doesn't come into all. So please be clear. However wrong the action of the defendant may be, no court will interfere with his act unless first you establish a legal right in you, and which right is sought to be affected, encroached upon, tampered with, which made you to come to court. In other words, what we call as, there should be a cause of action for this suit. What is a cause of action? When your legal right is sought to be infringed, it gives rise to a cause of action. So the pleading in a suit must encompass all these things, and it is not the number of pages writing stories which will enable you to persuade the court to grant the relief which you have sought for. Now, the second and most important thing which a lawyer who drafts a plan must bear in mind is, This injunction is an equitable remedy. It is a relief in equity. Now, we have said a person who wants the relief should come to the court with clean hands. He who seeks equity should do equity. This is how the principles are about. But fortunately, in this country, we cannot rest assured with those principles. It finds a statutory recognition. Where do you get this? Section 41 of the Specific Relief Act says in what cases no injunction could be granted. Clause I of Section 41 states injunction cannot be granted when the conduct of the applicant or his agent has been such as to disentitle him to the assistance of the courts. Explicitly, it is put in black and white. In fact, the section reads as under: an injunction cannot be granted when the conduct of the plaintiff or his agents has been such as to disentitle him to the assistance of the court. No one is kept in confusion. Those English principles finds a statutory recognition in clause I of Section 41 of the Specific Relief Act. So therefore, these two principles, which we talk about when we are talking about injunction. What are those principles? One, he who seeks equity must do equity. Two, he who comes into equity must come with clean hands. We'll come to the case on merits. Because it is an equitable relief, unless you are clean, unless you are fair, you cannot expect the court to come to your aid. So therefore, I find people arguing this, but they must know it has a statutory recognition in India in clause 5I of Section 41. So when statutorily it is provided, no court can overcome it. And therefore, the first and the foremost requirement that is to be exhibited before a court is that his hands are clean. That is the reason why drafting is a very art. If you, while drafting, you are not careful. By intelligent drafting, you think you suppress true facts, or you cover facts. It is all right to get an ex parte injunction. But once the other side appears and he points out to the court, here is a case where deliberately truth has been suppressed. Without anything more, the court would be justified in vacating the order of injunction. So shortcut methods get short-circuited. That is the first principle you should bear in mind when you are thinking of injunctions. You should take the court to confidence. You must exhibit your bona fides. In fact, there are some cases where it is impossible to convince the court. Let me tell you an example. A senior counsel of high repute was arguing before me. I started putting a few questions. He could not answer. But he told me, I will not be able to answer all these questions. Having regard to my standing at the bar, I make a submission at the bar. Some great injustice is done. Court's interference is required. I know he is an advocate who will not say anything for the sake of money. He has seen enough money. He has seen enough judges. When I say conduct of the party, conduct of the lawyer also counts. Once you are able to develop a reputation in the bar, here is a lawyer who does not bluff, who does not mislead, then that personality of yours may in a given case come to the aid of the client, and the lawyer were to blindly say, beyond this I don't have, but I personally feel the injustice is done, after all, it's a discretion left to the court. It is impossible to place before the court at that stage 100% evidence. So therefore, it is called an equitable relief. I say not only the party should come to the court with clean hands, the lawyer who conducts that case also should have fairness in approach, and getting an injunction is not everything in life. Of course, everybody has their own philosophy in this profession, and some people have mastered manipulation. By any stretch, they should get an injunction, otherwise they think the client will not either pay the fixed fee or whatever it is. But let me tell you, after 45 years, all this doesn't count in the long run. If you are able to develop a personality, fighting for a cause, knowing the limitation, and if you are able to make a responsible submission in the court with full knowledge of that particular branch of law, that goes a long way. And that's where you find sometimes when a senior counsel with standing appears and makes a request, injunction is granted, and you are yet to open your eyes and you are not granted. Though Advocates Act says, once you are enrolled as an advocate, all are equal. That is in theory. In practical, it is not possible. You cannot say a person has put in 50 years of practice and a person has entered the profession today are same. However intelligent you may be, the experience counts. Of course, merely because you have a gray hair, we don't work. If you have really practiced it for 50 years, along with that court craft, that experience, and all this is very important in a case for injunction. That's where when you seek an injunction order, not only the conduct of the client should be clean, even the lawyer should have a standing, which will weigh when the court hears him and grants an order of injunction. So therefore, unless the client or the plaintiff is honest and free from fraud and illegality, this equitable relief cannot be expected. Even if it is obtained by misleading the court, it will not last long. The moment you are exposed, the order is likely to be vacated. So therefore, this second principle, that it is an equitable relief and you must go to the court with clean hands, your conduct should such that the court should not find fault with you. And the third important thing which a lawyer should bear in mind is this is a discretionary relief. There is no question of you are pouncing on the judge or hitting the bench. However good case you may have, because it's equitable relief, it's a discretionary remedy, the court wields the ultimate discretion. Of course, when we say discretionary remedy, that does not mean whims and fancies. How a discretion is to be exercised is also now fairly well settled. But what I am trying to say is, it is a discretion remedy because today the statute itself says it. Section 36 of the Specific Relief Act states this preventive relief is granted at the discretion of the court by injunction, temporary or perpetual. So the statute itself says it is a discretion remedy. It may be permanent injunction, it may be temporary injunction, it may be mandatory injunction, whatever injunction, it is a discretionary remedy. Of course, the discretion must be exercised in a judicial manner and only in clear cases and according to well-settled judicial principles and not act in an arbitrary manner. Here, let me tell you, we have said well-settled judicial principles. Only if the judge has read those principles, he is aware of it, then he can exercise the discretionary manner. Suppose he is innocent, then what should happen to the discretion? That's where the role of a lawyer comes. Once a person is appointed as judge, he is a judge. but there is no guarantee that he has all the requisite qualifications. He may have passed the examination. That is only for the examination he has studied, he has passed. But to exercise these discretionary powers conferred under a statute, that examination passing is no good, degree is no good. He must have actually gone through that. Now, for example, a person who exclusively practiced on the criminal side becomes a civil judge. His understanding of discretion is only in granting bails and giving benefit of doubt and acquitting him. But this is a totally different area. So therefore, don't proceed on the assumption that the judge knows everything. That's precisely what was the law previously. That they thought judge does not know, the lawyer should go there, he should enlighten him, he should make him know. Today, unfortunately, neither the lawyer knows the law, the judge knows the law, and the justice suffers. So therefore, you 5 years law course students who are very intelligent, please look into these provisions. It says a discretionary remedy. What is the discretion? What is the judicial principles which are well settled? First, you must know it. When you make a submission, you must enlighten that judge even if he does not know. Chances are, if you have the persuasive capacity, if you are thorough with the subject, not only will learn, he may appreciate it and grant you relief. So simply throwing a suit for injunction and saying these are the principles doesn't hold good. You must make little extra effort. So first you must study. When I say discretionarily, when you draft a plaint also, there must be some sufficient material therein, either in the affidavit or in the plaint, which influences the mind of the judge to exercise the discretion in your favor. So it is not simply repeating the words found in Order 39, Rule 1 and 2. Facts. When you say discretion, what is the discretion which you want the court to do? What are the facts which will be in your favor? What facts could impress upon the judge so that he could exercise the discretion in your favor? So once it is a discretion remedy, it is ruled out that you cannot ask it as a matter of right. It depends on the facts of the case. It depends on the circumstance of the case. It depends on the knowledge of the judge. It also depends on your knowledge. The other three things are not in your hand. Your knowledge is in your hand. First, in a discretionary matters, before you call upon the discretion of the court to be exercised in a particular manner, the settled legal principles will say what are the facts which are to be placed before the court. By looking into it, the court will exercise the discretion. So, therefore, whenever it's a discretion remedy, be careful. Don't rub the judge on the wrong side. Judge is also a human being. If you rub him on the wrong side, the discussion goes the other way. At the same time, you did not prostrate before him. Then it is opposed to advocacy. So therefore, that's where the art of advocacy comes in. An advocate should be a gentleman. He should be thorough with this subject. He should be a professional. He should know what to say, and he should know when to stop also. If you follow all this, probably chances of indiscretionary remedies, that discretion being exercised in your favor, of course, if there's a merits in the case, are great. So therefore, when we are talking about injunction, it is not a simple thing. As I said, the discretionary remedy. If you want the judge to grant you relief, you have to go an extra mile and place sufficient material on record so that if he does not know the settled judicial principles, tell him the judicial principles, and then let him apply his mind with those principles in the background to the facts of the case so that he could grant the relief sought for. So this is something which is applicable to all cases. Now, when coming to injunctions, let me tell you, the common man's confidence in the judiciary depends upon the way the lawyer and the judges function in the present system. Who are the persons who come to court? Persons, either they don't have money, persons who are away from power, persons who cannot manage police stations, manage politicians. In the end of the day, they knock the doors of the court. In fact, that's precisely the reason why the courts are meant. Before court, it doesn't matter who the litigant is. If he has a case, if there is a threat to his legal right, a duty is cast on the judicial officer to interfere and protect his right, and then only the public's confidence in the judiciary is enhanced. People come to court. Why do they come to court? If courts were to refuse reliefs, why should the people come to court? Similarly, the lawyers also have a role to play. They should see to that this process is not abused. And once it is abused, they blame the judiciary. They say this lawyer is a brilliant lawyer. A judge get topi haki ಏನೋ ಮಾಡ್ಬಿಟ್ಟ. It is not a good remark, both to the judiciary and to the lawyer and to the judge. See, once, I'm not saying that you should be 100% truthful. Sometimes it so happens when you are truthful, you don't get the relief. But at the same time, you cannot be manipulating the whole system. See, you must understand the society in which we are living. You must know the positive and negative aspects of your case. And you must try to project those positive aspects in such a manner that your client gets justice. The reason why I am saying this, people think if they pay the lawyer, go to court, they can get an injection. Just you get it to a medical shop, pay the money, you get the medicine. And sometimes if they don't get it, either they will blame the lawyer or they blame the judge. System doesn't work in that fashion. We are governed by the rule of law. There are set rules. There's a process. Both the lawyer and the judge should understand. So in that mind, when we talk about injunctions, broadly I can classify it as 4 types. What are they? First and the most dangerous and important is ex parte ad interim order of temporary injunction. That is what everybody wants. Then you say temporary injunction. Then we say perpetual or permanent injunction. Then we have what is called as mandatory injunction. Now, most of the people are not worried about this permanent injunction or mandatory injunction because it comes only after years. But everybody is interested in preferably an ex parte injunction and after contest a temporary injunction. Therefore, the entire exercise by the lawyers and the judges revolves around what is called as temporary injunctions. And it is a very efficacious remedy. If that jurisdiction is exercised properly, a relief is given to the party who is very badly in need of it. And to a person who thinks he is powerful because of his muscle power, money power, status, there is a system in the society which can prevent him. So the success of this depends on the lawyers and judges and their understanding of the law and the way they operate the system. Now coming to these temporary injunctions, again I am repeating this because this is all codified. In fact, that is the reason why you must make it a point to read the provisions of the Specific Relief Act. Subsection 1 of section 37 of the Specific Act deals with temporary injunctions. When an enactment gives a definition, there is no question of my giving my own definition. If it is not defined, we can say. But when this section says what a temporary injunction is, first you must be guided by that. And in areas where it doesn't apply, question of interpretation will arise. The subsection says temporary injunctions are such as are to continue until a specified time or until the further order of the court. And most important is, and they may be granted at any stage of the suit and are regulated by the Code of Civil Procedure 19. So your order 39 rule 1 to 5, it deals with temporary injunction, gets connected to the substantive law by virtue of this provision. By the very word temporary, temporary means till the disposal of the suit or till a particular stage. And that is what is more important. A person has a right, he has come to court, He's seeking a decree. It takes time. But after he approaches the court, till the court grants a final order, the minimum that is expected is to maintain a status quo. Even after coming to the court, what should not happen goes on happening. Then what is the purpose of coming to the court? That is the importance of a temporary injunction. And therefore, this temporary injunction plays a vital role in civil litigation. And let me tell you, in days to come, it will assume importance because today we are in an era of knowledge, that is intellectual properties. Hereafterwards, more and more litigations will start in the field of intellectual property rights. In fact, I had an occasion to go abroad and mix with these people, and foreigners also come and have what is called as workshops, conferences in 5-star hotels. They invite judges, they invite leading members of the bar, and they go on telling how this intellectual property is important, how they have to be protected, and what the judges should do. All this happens because, especially in the Western countries, they have a feeling that in India, especially in the field of civil litigation, there is enormous delay. And the litigation dealing with intellectual properties cannot afford this. In fact, I had an occasion to be in the Stanford University, where one of our friends from India, a youngster, he's yet to know what the world is, how our system works, was talking about the Indian judicial system and say how there's a delay in disposal of cases. Then when my turn came, I told the audience, in India, if there is no delay, delay is because we have two types of lawyers. That is, lawyers who are practicing on the intellectual property rights. Their practice is confined to air-conditioned chambers. But the relief to be granted in an intellectual property infringement is an injunction. You want a temporary injunction. And if you want a temporary injunction, an ex parte injunction, the remedy is under the Specific Relief Act. Remedy is under the Civil Procedure Code. And that is what a trial lawyer is fully equipped. Therefore, I told them, if you want speedy relief, engage one intellectual property lawyer who spends his time in the air-conditioned room, who knows about the law. You catch hold of a trial lawyer who is able to get into the court hall with physical force and then argue the matter so that you will get the relief. The reason why I am saying this is, this order of temporary injunction, if a person wants, he must know the procedural law of the land. And in days to come, this intellectual property litigation is going to multiply, and therefore it is necessary, especially for the present generation of lawyers, to know the intricacies of this temporary injunction as provided in the Code of Civil Procedure. Now, you find the section, subsection 1, as I said, they may be granted at any stage of the suit and are regulated by the Code of Civil Procedure. What is that regulation in the Code of Civil Procedure? This has reference to section 94C of the Civil Procedure. Please see that. Section 94 deals with supplementary proceedings. 94C reads as under, in order to prevent the ends of justice from being defeated, the court may, if it is so prescribed, grant a temporary injunction, and in case of disobedience, commit the person guilty thereof to the civil prison and order that his property be attached and sold. This is what the Civil Procedure Code says. 94C confers power on the court to grant injunction if there is a disobedience, to attach his property, arrest him and send him to prison. So this provision is elaborated in Order 39. And that is where the entire law of temporary injunction, as looked into by the present generation of lawyers, is seen. All that I am saying is, before you come to Order 39, the provisions which I told you, which are contained in the Specific Relief Act, also should be looked into, understood, and in that background, you read Order 39, then it makes sense. Now, Order 39 says temporary injunctions. Of course, and interlocutory orders. Let us not worry about interlocutory. Temporary injunctions. Order 39, Rule 1 to 5 deal with temporary injunctions. It specifically says in what cases temporary injunction can be granted. That's why I said, don't look into English law. Don't look into Chancery Division courts. We have a statute, and it is meticulously sets out these cases in which an injunction could be granted. Now let us carefully read this provision, which makes a lot of sense. Where in any suit it is proved by affidavit or otherwise. At this point, let me also point out a litigant thinks when he has a problem, I will come to court for other things. First, you get me an injunction. Sometimes I find lawyers coming from various other fields, because there's no age bar, anybody can get in. They also have a meaning. First get an injunction, afterwards we'll file a suit. So for them, this should be pointed out. Where in any suit it is proved by affidavit or otherwise, first there should be a suit. Without a suit, no injunction. First a suit, and in that suit, an application for injunction. So there can't be an injunction first and then a suit. So where in any suit, it is proved by affidavit or otherwise that any property in dispute in a suit, again, in a suit, is in danger of being one, wasted, damaged, alienated by any party to the suit. Please mark these words, by any party to the suit, or wrongfully sold in execution of a decree. Plaintiff files a suit against the defendant. So person who should get the relief is the plaintiff, and the relief should be against the defendant. Now, we have in practice seen, whenever a plaintiff files a suit for injunction, defendant also files a suit for application for injunction in the suit. A lot of controversy, and now we thought it's well settled that in a plaintiff suit on the same cause of action, the defendant also can file a suit for injunction. Sometimes it so happens, plaintiff application is dismissed, defendant gets the injunction. Heartburn. But it is not without jurisdiction. Please see the word. That's why the plaintiff has come to court with respect to a property. His object is that till that right to the property is decided, if there's a threat of the property being wasted, threat of property being damaged, threat of the property being alienated, that should be proven. Understandable. But the section says, by any party to the suit. That is, merely because the plaintiff files a suit in respect of a property and complaining of all these things against the defendant, he doesn't have a right to waste it. He doesn't have a right to damage it. He cannot alienate the property. That means status quo is to be maintained. So the person who can make an application in such circumstances need not be only plaintiff, even defendant can. The word used is by any party to the suit. The reason why I am pointing out this is, for more than a period of 40 years, in our state at any rate, we understood the law as, in every suit, defendant also can file an application. Then our High Court had an occasion to read it carefully. That was the position under English law. That's why I said our law is codified. We are bound by the statutory law. Now see the next. That the defendant threatens or intends to remove or dispose of his property with a view to defrauding his creditors. A deals with by any party to the suit. B speaks about defendant's threats. C, that the defendant threatens to dispossess the plaintiff or otherwise cause injury to the plaintiff in relation to any property in dispute. So what is the difference between A, B and C? If the relief sought for falls under A, either party to the proceedings can file an application. If the relief sought for falls under B and C, defendant cannot file an application. Only plaintiff has to file an application. But unfortunately, in Karnataka, the law was in respect of all the three. Both could file an application. That judgment is overruled. Now the law which holds the field is only if the relief sought falls under A, both plaintiff and defendant can maintain an application. If the relief sought for falls under B and C, it is only the plaintiff and plaintiff alone who is entitled to the relief. In such circumstances, what the section says is the court may, by order, grant a temporary injunction to restrain such act or make such other order for the purpose of staying and preventing the wasting, damaging, alienation, sale, removal, or disposing the property, or disposing the plaintiff, or otherwise causing injury to the plaintiff in relation to any property in dispute in the suit as the court thinks fit, until the disposal of the suit or until further orders. So this is an equitable relief. This is a discretionary remedy. This is a relief given to a person who has come to court with clean hands, complaining of infringement of his right. So conditions are clearly stipulated, and sometimes this threat may be a continuing one. So plaintiff need not go on filing suit after suit. Therefore, Rule 2 says, injunction to restrain repetition or continuance of breach. So in either event, a person is entitled to an order of injunction. Now, before a person could be granted this relief, what are the principles which underline this grant of temporary injunction? In what case, what the plaintiff has to do if he wants that injunction? That is well known. As I said earlier, he should come to the court with hands. That's the first step. Then the three steps which are well settled now is one, as I said, he must have a prima facie case. He must have a prima facie case. Mere prima facie case is not sufficient. The balance of convenience also should be in his favor. They say even that is not sufficient. There should be an irreparable injury if injunction is not there. These three conditions ought to be read conjunctively, not disjunctively. He should come to the court with clean hands. He should make out a prima facie case. Balance of convenience should be in his favor, and the act complained of will result in irreparable injury if the court doesn't interfere. So therefore, this is the heart of a relief of temporary injury, not permanent injury, temporary injury. Therefore, when you are drafting a plaint, you must bear in this mind these things. Evidence is all right, trial is all right. Now you are seeking an injunction. What will the court look into? Your pleadings and the documents you are going to support, plus your arguments. Your argument should be based on the pleadings and the documents. You can't argue, you can't plead something and then you can't argue something else and get an order. That doesn't work like that. Therefore, when you draft a plaint, that plaint should contain allegations, if read, should make out a prima facie case. Therefore, drafting skill is to be developed. So therefore, what do you mean by a prima facie case? Prima facie, on the face of it, what you are saying on the face of it should disclose that you have a right. So unless you are able to show prima facie that you have a right, the question of granting injunction would not arise. When we say prima facie case, not only you must plead your case, and the dispute you are trying to plead should be a real one. A serious question has to be gone into. Then only the court can say, I cannot do anything at this stage. All right, that's a matter for trial. From what you say, what I can make out was, you have a right, there is a threat to that right, a serious matter is involved, it takes time, and therefore, the requirement of a prima facie case is made out. As I said, that by itself is not sufficient to grant an injunction. Now tell me, let me give you a few illustrations. The plaintiff has gone to court by saying, I am in lawful possession, I am in peaceful possession. The defendant who has no right is trying to interfere with that possession. There is a threat of disposition that you have written. Fine. But how do you make out a prima facie case? When you say I am in possession, there must be some material with you to show that you are in possession. A mere saying I am in possession of an immovable property is not sufficient. If you are a tenant, there must be a lease deed. If you are an agreement holder, there must be an agreement. If you are the owner of the property, you must have a title deed. You are a licensee, yes, there should be a license. So there must be something to show. That is at the initial stage. If you are a tenant, you are paying rents. If you are a owner, you are paying taxes. There will be a kata endorsement. You might have put up a construction by taking a plan. So all these documents, prima facie shows you are in possession of the property. And then if you are satisfied that you are in possession, the Indian law is nobody who is in possession cannot be thrown out by taking law to his own hands. Everybody should be evicted, dispossessed in accordance with law. Even a real owner cannot take law to his own hands. He has to take possession in accordance with law. So therefore, what is more important is prima facie, you must be able to show you are in possession. Pleading is all right, then you must produce some document to show that you are in possession. If you are saying, I am the owner, ownership of an immovable property, you cannot prove by oral evidence. You cannot prove by unregistered documents. You cannot produce taxpayer receipt, ration card, electricity bill will not show that you are a title. You may be staying in that. In all that document, your property particulars may be there, but it's not document of title. If you are saying, I am the owner of the property, and the other man is challenging my title and is trying to interfere, then you must show. If you are say I am in possession, those documents will be sufficient. If you say I am the owner, that document is not sufficient, and you must produce prima facie the document of title. If you are trying to enforce a contractual obligation, yes, contract may be oral, it may be in writing. To establish a oral contract is not that easy. But if it is reduced into writing, and that is your case, you must produce that contract. And that obligation which you are pointing out should be there in that contract. So therefore, prima facie case means produce that contract, point out the obligation, then tell me what your right is, and a prima facie case is made. And if you are claiming a status, if you are claiming an office, yes, all that have to be shown by producing documents prima facie. So therefore, prima facie is to be understood in that context, not by merely saying it, not writing 10 pages. Court should be satisfied that you have a prima facie case. When those documents are looked into, and if it is not challenged, that is sufficient to grant you a decree, a prima facie case is made out. As I said, mere prima facie case is not sufficient. The law is, that is the first step. Then you must further prove, if an order of injunction is not granted, I will be in serious trouble. Therefore, the court must weigh the case of the plaintiff and what you have said about the defendant. If it's a contested matter, written statement is there. Defendant will say what his case is. Plaintiff has said what his case is. It is for the court to weigh and then find out in whose favor the balance of convenience lies, and then make up his mind. And third ingredient is irreparable injury. If you don't grant injunction, tomorrow I am not there. It is irreparable. It cannot be compensated in terms of money. Damages is not ready. You must be able to establish that to show it is an irreparable. So only when all these four ingredients are present, that is, that you have come to the court with clean hands, a prima facie case is made out, balance of convenience is in your favor, and irreparable injury is shown, can it be said a case for injunction made out. So it all depends upon advocacy skill, your knowledge of law, how you are able to put forth your case before the court. Now, the real test of a lawyer arises when he is trying to get what is called as an ex parte interim order of temporary injunction. The rule is no ex parte injunction shall be granted. If an ex parte injunction in an undeserving case is granted, the damage done to the opposite party is because of the injunction order. It is because of the court, not because of the party. Party will ask for the moon. The court should be careful in granting that relief. Therefore, Rule 3 specifically says how this discretionary order of temporary injunction is to be exercised. Before granting injunction, court to direct notice to opposite party. So as a rule, no ex parte injunction. As a rule, no ex parte injunction. Notice is the rule. But there are some cases where if you follow that rule, the very object of providing this remedy is taken away. Realizing that the legislature has said, though the rule is issue notice, because that rule is based on principles of natural justice. Without hearing the opposite party is going to be affected, you should not pass any order. That's a wonderful principle. But it has an exception. What is that exception? The court shall in all cases, direct notice of the application for the same to be given to the opposite party. That is the rule. But the court shall in all cases, except where it appears that the object of granting the injunction will be defeated by the delay before granting an injunction. So, as a rule, no ex parte injunction, but it has an exception. If you issue notice, the very purpose of approaching the court may be defeated. In such cases, court has the power to grant an ex parte injunction. And in fact, the court takes the risk because unless the court is sure about it, it should not grant. Here, a sort of misunderstanding between the bench and the bar. The lawyers think this ex parte injunction should be granted as a matter of course. But that is not the law. At the same time, there is a provision, next provision, 3A. If you grant an ex parte injunction, then application will be disposed of within 30 days. For a judge, it's a headache. If you issue notice, no problem. And then, if you are granting an injunction, the law imposes certain obligations on the court. A conscious judge would not be afraid of that. A conscious lawyer will not mistake the court because he knows the case better than anybody else. So therefore, it is in these circumstances, it is better to know what the law is and act according to the law. Though the rule is no ex parte injunction, when the court said you can grant an ex parte injunction, it has prescribed certain conditions. And that condition should be satisfied. Before that is satisfied, the court should be satisfied if an ex parte injunction is not granted, a serious mischief will ensue to the plaintiff. The grievance is, they are going to demolish my building. They are going to throw me out. If the threat is imminent, and if you issue injunction, they will throw you out, and then case goes on. If the court is satisfied, yes, if I don't interfere at this stage, a mischief will ensue to the plaintiff, a case for ex parte order is made. Then he has to find out, assuming I grant an injunction, what is the injustice which will be caused to the defendant? Here let me tell you, from my little experience and what's happening, not only today, for years. A person who is not in possession will manage to get an injunction and get into property and throw away a person who is legal. That's an abuse. Therefore, court should be more careful. If an injunction is not granted, what is the injustice which will happen to the other side should weigh in the mind of the court. Then the question is, when did the plaintiff approaching the court? Is he approaching court immediately, or has he slept over the matter? If he has slept over the matter, notice is the order. But he has come to the court at the earliest point of opportunity, and still the court doesn't extend its gate, probably he would be committing a mistake. So that is another factor we should weigh in the mind of the judge. Therefore, your attempt should be to acquaint the judge of all these factors. And you must also, judge also should be satisfied that the application is made in utmost good faith. After all this, the best way to see that no injustice is done to the opposite party is, don't grant an injunction for an unlimited period. Grant it till the next hearing date. If really it is causing inconvenience, the defendant will come with an application for advancement. But on the day, if he doesn't appear, he only says, I will engage a counsel, counsel files an engagement and wants statement, probably the discretion exercised by the court is perfect, no injustice. So this is what a judge is expected to do. If this is what a judge is expected to do, what is the lawyer is expected to do? So lawyer should be concentrating on these aspects and persuade the judge to grant an ex parte order. Don't leave it to the discretion, merely because discretion, don't leave it to him. It is a judicial discretion. And these are the facts which will weigh with the mind of the court, and every effort should be made by the lawyer to place before the court all these aspects. Now, once the court grants an injunction, the law imposes certain obligations, both on the lawyer and the judge. What are they? Provided that where it is proposed to grant an injunction without notice of the application to the opposite party, please see what it says. The court shall record the reasons for its opinion. That's one guarantee. The court is not acting in an arbitrary matter. What is that you saw? What is that you heard? Please, in a brief note, make a note. Why you are granting an ex parte order of temporary injunction. And the object of the grant injunction will be defeated by delay. That's what he has to record the reasons. If I don't grant this injunction, this is going to happen. The very purpose of approaching the court will be defeated. He must write a short order which made him to grant an ex parte order. After that, to see that the defendant is not put to any inconvenience because of his order, he should require the applicant. That's where the lawyer role comes. Require the applicant to do what? To deliver to the opposite party or to send him by registered post immediately after the order granting the injunction has been made, a copy of the application for injunction together with copy of the affidavit filed in support of the application, a copy of the plain, copies of documents which the applicant relies on. So the whole object is, I have made up my mind. I may be right, I may be wrong. But if it is a wrong exercise of discretion, once the entire material is made available to the opposite party, he can rush to the court. He can seek for advancement of the case. He can point out that I am ruined by your order, so that the court can open his eyes, find out the truth, and if really damage has been done, it can recall the order. Court has the power to recall the order. And how do you ensure? You can ask them to do it. But if they don't do it, therefore the section says to file on the day on which injunction is granted or on the day immediately following the day an affidavit stating that the copies aforesaid have been so delivered or sent. This is what the law expects the court to do in the event it grants an ex parte injunction. This is what the lawyer appearing for the plaintiff is expected to do if he has come to the court with clean hands and if we want that injunction to be there. If the advocate of the party does not comply with his obligation, take it from me, without going into the merits, that is sufficient to vacate the order. If the other side jumps into the court hall and says, virtually your order has ruined me. Therefore, in your enthusiasm to get injunction, fine, do your best. At the same time, obey the law. This provision enables the opposite party against whom an order is passed behind his back to come back to the court, and if real injustice has been done, to get it set right. So therefore, when we are talking about injunction, it only shows how powerful is this remedy. If it is misused, what can happen? It also shows how the legislature has taken precautions to see that the interests of both the parties are protected. And then it says 3A, it was not there with an amendment, where an injunction has been granted without giving notice to the opposite party. The court shall make an endeavor to finally dispose of the application within 30 days from the date on which the injunction was granted, and where it is unable to do so, it shall record its reasons for such inability. So, judge can't plead inability. He can't say COVID. If there is COVID, don't grant it. If you have granted it, you must hear and dispose it off immediately. Because when an injunction is granted, and if an innocent person is affected by it, the injustice is done not by the party, it is by the court. Therefore, court should be careful. Maybe error is human, and if the court has committed a mistake, if it is convinced, it can recall the order and see that justice is done. Of course, Rule 4 also provides for, after an injunction order is granted, you can make an application for vacating it on the ground that certain facts which are not within their knowledge was not brought to the notice, and there is change of circumstances, or there is undue hardship, and the court has the ample power to alter, modify, vary the orders. This is about what is called as temporary injunction, ex parte injunction, temporary injunction, pending disposal of the suit on merits. I think I have taken sufficient time, and lawyers would be interested only this much. The other thing, they leave it to the judge. So let us leave it to the judge, the remaining provision. This is what a lawyer, practitioner would be very much important. So all my appeal to the younger members of the bar is, be professionals. This is a wonderful remedy, very cheap remedy. You can value the suit for 1,000 rupees, 100, and the relief which you get is so enormous. It cannot be sometimes valued in terms of money. And such a wonderful judicial process should not be abused. As a lawyer, you owe a duty. As a judge, he owes a duty to see that this efficient judicial system is a model to others, and especially when we have so much criticism, probably the present generation can rise to the occasion and see that these judicial processes are strictly done in conformity with the statute, and we could be proud of our judicial system. Our judicial system is second to none. Our judicial system, according to me, is the best in the world. The problem is with the person who are managing the show. And I'm sure the present generation, the future generation will make up that good, and we could be proud of our system and also the legal fraternity.